Buddhism in China, from its inception through the Tang persecution of 842 through 845 of the Common Era. A videography by Brenda Smaggi. Buddhism is a tradition that has spread widely and changed vastly since its origination. China is among the areas influenced by the spread of Buddhism. While Buddhism was not immediately accepted in China, it flourished and had a great impact on Chinese culture. However, in the process, Buddhism itself was transformed. Many uniquely Chinese schools of Buddhism emerged in China during its period of acceptance. However, the golden age of Chinese Buddhism came to an abrupt end with the Tang persecution. Early cultural ties and trade between China and Central Asia provided the means for the entrance of Buddhism into China. When trade increased between China and Central Asia during the Han Dynasty in the 1st century of the Common Era, people began to learn about Buddhism. The arrival of Buddhist monks in the year 67 of the Common Era, including the monks Dharmaraksa and Kasyapa Matanga, is said to mark the official introduction of Buddhism in China. While these early contacts are important to note in the transmission of Buddhism into Chinese culture, the primary arrival of much Buddhist thought was along the Silk Road beginning in the 2nd century of the Common Era. In the 2nd century, there was further development of Buddhist communities in China, which can be traced back to the year 148 of the Common Era in Luoyang, where until the end of the 3rd century of the Common Era, a number of Buddhist translators and teachers were working. However, Buddhism did not immediately gain a large following, as it entered China during a period where the predominant religions of Confucianism and Taoism were already established and firmly in place. The meeting of Confucianism and Taoism with Buddhism is an important factor in the development of Chinese Buddhism, as Confucianism and Taoism had profound effects on the acceptance of Buddhism and the types of Buddhism that would flourish in China. Confucianism, one of the predominant religions in China, was based upon the hierarchical relationship of individuals and promoted social stability, order, strong families, and practical living. Buddhist concepts of monasticism and the enlightenment of the individual were in direct conflict with the Confucian ideals of the family and the emperor. This conflict is one of the reasons that Buddhism was not met with open arms in China. While Buddhist and Confucian ideals contradicted each other, Buddhism was less antithetical to Taoism, the other major religion of China. Yet Buddhism was not completely in line with Taoism, as Taoism is based upon the relationships between an individual and nature, and at its core Taoism sought harmony with the natural world, while Buddhism sought to master the inner world. However, due to some similarities between Buddhism and Taoism, Buddhism was initially considered to be a foreign corruption of Taoism. Thus, while Buddhism did not get off to a great start in China, by the 2nd century of the Common Era, aided to some extent by the simplicity of its approach and some similarities with Taoism, it managed to gain a firm foothold and acquired a sizable following. Other factors had an impact on the acceptance of Buddhism in China, such as the subsequent chaotic periods of 16 kingdoms and southern and northern dynasties, which changed the situation, resulting in state support of Buddhism. The Age of Division, which spanned from the year 220 to the year 589 of the Common Era, began with the fall of the Han Dynasty, and was marked by political division and governments unable to gain firm control of their territories. The Western Jin Dynasty united China briefly, but marked further erosion of centralized imperial control by their policy of parceling out enormous tracts of land to imperial princes. The imperial princes all sought the succession of the throne, which ended in many bloody struggles and a civil war that broke out in the capital between the years 291 and 305 of the Common Era. After the civil war that raged on in the capital, China remained a battlefield for over a century. This period is known as the 16 Kingdoms, and lasted from the year 304 to the year 439 of the Common Era. China was not easily unified, and the northern and southern regions of China remained under separate rule from the early 5th century of the Common Era through the late 6th century of the Common Era, while southern China remained under the rule of native dynasties whose rulers were devout Buddhists. northern China was under the control of non-Chinese rulers who showed favor for the Buddhist religion. The Buddhist rulers of southern China saw to the construction of numerous temples, participated in Buddhist ceremonies, and organized public talks on Buddhism. The Buddhists in southern China, which did not have a direct connection to Central Asia as did the Buddhists in northern China, worked to translate, interpret, and elaborate on the Buddhist texts and ideals by writing commentaries to fit within the framework of traditional Chinese philosophy and religion. In northern China, the centers of Buddhist learning were closer in contact with Central Asia, and awareness of the foreign origins of Buddhism was kept alive through the active and earnest efforts of translation. Buddhist art also flourished in the north in this period due to the royal patronage of the rulers who favored Buddhism. Along with the differences in respect to Buddhism in the north and south, the speed at which Buddhism spread in the regions was also different. While Buddhism spread slower in southern China due to the elite families that dominated politics, Buddhism spread more rapidly in northern China due to the social upheaval that worked to break cultural barriers between the elite ruling families and the general populace. With the weak governments of these times, confidence in the Confucian view of the social and political order declined, and people in all walks of life found hope in religions promising salvation and transcendence. These declines in trust of Confucianism led to an expansion of Taoism and the Buddhist religion in China. In this period, when it was difficult to place much faith in civil governments, China encountered a religion whose reach extended way beyond any known government. This religion was that of Buddhism. In the South, the upper classes often discovered Buddhism through their academic pursuits and the exploration of Neo-Taoism, while the sophisticated gentry dwelled on the philosophical and mystical aspects of Buddhism. The rural folk followed Buddhism in their own superstitious and simple ways, imparting to it in the process a peculiar Chinese character. The differential development of Buddhism among different social classes in China is part of what made Buddhism in China unique. However, while there were distinct forms of Buddhism among the different social classes, Buddhism also helped to transcend class differences, as inscriptions from members of all social classes can be seen on Buddhist statues and temples, suggesting that members from different social classes worked together on these projects. With the reunification of China under the Sui and Tang dynasties, Buddhism from northern and southern China cross-fertilized each other and strengthened the hold of Buddhism in Chinese society. The Sui and Tang dynasties were great patrons of Buddhism, and it was at this time that Buddhism reached its peak in China. It is the Tang dynasty that is known as the Golden Age of Chinese Buddhism. Empress Wu, the only female to take the title of emperor in the history of China, was among the greatest patrons of Buddhism during the time of the Tang dynasty. The empress gained much support for her advocacy of Buddhism. The empress also used Buddhism to legitimize her ascent to the throne and the establishment of the Zhou dynasty by circulating the Great Cloud Sutra, which predicted the imminent reincarnation of the Buddha Maitreya as a female monarch, under whom all the world would be free of illness, worry, and disaster. With state support of Buddhism, the religion was allowed to flourish in China. However, the spread of Buddhism would not have occurred without the dedication of Buddhist scholars who came to China from the East and worked selflessly to make Buddhism a mass religion. These Buddhist scholars worked at translating Buddhist texts into the Chinese language and forming teachings based on the Buddhist texts. One of the most well-known translators was Kumarajiva, who established the first imperial translation bureau in the north. Kumarajiva translated a large number of important texts and revised the earlier Chinese translations. His translations are still in use to this day. The buildings of monasteries and temples by devout Buddhists for the practice of the religion transformed the landscape of China, the beauty of Buddhist architecture appealing to people of all classes. With the massive increase of Buddhist texts in China, the Buddhists were left with the issue of how they would put their teachings into practice. Many different Buddhist schools arose, and each focused on certain Buddhist texts or doctrines for their study and practice of the religion. Among the many schools that arose, Several principal schools of Buddhism flourished in China. The first of these schools is the Vinayana school, also known as the Lu-tsung, which focused on the monastic discipline, the Vinaya, of the Buddhist monks. It has been said that the Vinayana school was founded in the 7th century of the Common Era by Tao San. While this school stuck to the strict rules of monastic discipline, other schools focused on the teachings of the Buddha through other doctrine. The realistic school, also known as Chu-she, focused on the Abhidhamma kosha of the figure Vasubandhu for its inspiration. Another prominent school, the Three Treatises school, also known as Sanlun, focused on more than one doctrine for its teachings, and followed both the Madhyamaka Sutras of Nagarjuna and the Shata Shastra of Aryadeva. Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka Sutras taught the concepts of emptiness, as he praises in his work Verses from the Center, when he states, "I bow down to the most sublime of speakers, the completely awakened one who taught contingency, no cessation, no birth, no annihilation, no permanence, no coming, no going, no difference, no identity, to ease fixations." The idealist school, Fa Xiang, like the realistic school, was based on the teachings of Vasubandhu. This school was founded on the ideals of the Yogacara school. The idealist school gained much popularity in China due to the great scholar and translator San Sang, who traveled to India to collect many original Buddhist texts and relics and bring them back to China. San Sang spent much of his life spreading the teachings of Vasubandhu. A school of Buddhism that was introduced into China directly from India was that of the Mantra or Tantric school, also known as Mi-sung or Shen-yin. This was the Chinese version of Tantric Buddhism. The main text used for the teachings of this school was the Mahavarokana Sutra, which emphasized elaborate rituals. The Tantric school focused on magic, incantations, drawing of mandalas, casting of spells, and elaborate and often secret rituals. This school flourished for less than a century in China and was later replaced by Lamaism, which is a more popular version of Tantricism. A school that flourished in China for about 2 centuries was that of the Avatamsaka or Flower Adornment School, also known as Huayan, which was based on the teachings of the Buddha in the Avatamsaka Sutra, which was believed to contain the most complex teachings of the Buddha that were not comprehensible to ordinary followers of Buddhism. The primary focus of the school was on the philosophy of interpenetration and mutual containment. This school held the belief that in each and every aspect the cosmic reality reflected the same relationships and balance of forces, signifying the ultimate truth of one in all and all in one. The Avatamsaka school was founded by Tu-shun, as his commentary of the Avatamsaka Sutra provided the basis for the emergence of this school of Buddhism. 4 patriarchs followed Tu-shun. These patriarchs were Che-hien, Fa Sang, Qiangling, and Song Mi. Fa Sang, the 3rd patriarch of Huayan Buddhism, made great contributions to the school through his translations of, commentaries on, and systematization of the flower garland doctrine. The Tian Tai or White Lotus school, also known as Fa Hua, also focused on the highest teachings of the Buddha, just as the Avatamsaka school did. The White Lotus school, however, provided a more elaborate view of the cosmic reality. The White Lotus school was a major tradition of Chinese Buddhism, with its teachings based on the Lotus Sutra, or Sadharma Pundarika Sutra, which it considered the king of sutras. The Sadharma Pundarika Sutra was believed to be the vehicle of all truths, and it was believed that this truth operated from 3 levels or aspects. The practices of concentration and insight were advocated by the White Lotus school as a means to attain the Buddha mind, in which the above-mentioned 3 aspects of truth reside in perfect harmony. Another predominant school that flourished in China was that of the Pure Land school, Qingtu. The Pure Land School was a devotional school of Buddhism, founded by Huaiyan, who was originally a Taoist before he converted to Buddhism, and was based upon the teachings of the Mahayana school and the belief in bodhisattvas. The school promoted the practice of devotional forms of worship, specifically the worship of Amitabha. This Pure Land School is one of the surviving Chinese schools of Buddhism, and is still in existence in various forms to this day. The most popular Chinese school of Buddhism was that of the Dhyana school, or the Chan school, which focused not on the learning of Buddhist texts, but rather on the day-to-day events of ordinary living as the means to enlightenment. The Dhyana school focused on meditation or contemplation as the means to develop inner stillness through finding enlightenment during mundane tasks. It did not stress the importance of meditation as strictly as Zen Buddhism did. This form of Buddhism is about a return to essentials, the impulse being to sweep all the training paraphernalia in the form of teachings, texts, codes of morality, etc., and get to the heart of the matter, the direct insight which transformed Siddhartha Gautama into the Buddha. Thus it can be seen that many forms of Buddhism flourished during this golden age in China. However, the golden age that began in the Tang Dynasty was ended with the Tang persecution of Buddhism in the year 842 through 845 of the Common Era. The fall of Buddhism in China began when it faced persecution during the reign of the Chinese Emperor Lu-tsung, a Taoist emperor. Noticing the greed that characterized many monasteries, he ordered for the general destruction of all Buddhist establishments and return of all Buddhist monks and nuns to lay life. The emperor also ordered the confiscation of temple land and the destruction of all Buddhist images. While the persecution of 845 did not completely destroy Buddhism, it marks the definite decline of Buddhism in China. Thus it can be seen that the history of Buddhism in China, from its inception through the Tang persecution, was quite unique. From the meeting of Buddhism with the established religions of Confucianism and Taoism, Buddhism in China was shaped to fit the culture that it had entered. After a period without much support, Buddhism began to find a firm foothold during the Age of Division. This following grew steadily and reached its peak during the Tang Dynasty when it received the support of the state and its royal patrons. While many prominent Buddhist schools emerged during this golden age of Buddhism, most were wiped out during the Tang persecution of 845. However, while the persecution marked the decline of Buddhism in China, Buddhism in China has not been completely destroyed, and some unique forms of Buddhism that were formed in China continue to be practiced today.